I came home from a 10-hour shift to find a brand new deadbolt on my own front door and a handwritten note taped to the frame that said, "Sorry, I've decided to stay." Let's talk about new terms. That's when I decided we were done talking. Let me tell you about Derek. I met Derek through a mutual friend named Paul. Paul vouched for him hard. Said Derek was solid, responsible, the kind of guy who returns borrowed tools. I needed someone to sublet my apartment for 4 months, while I took a temporary contract job in a city 3 hours away. The plan was simple. Derek pays $1,100 a month, covers utilities, keeps the place clean, and leaves by October 31st. I'd be back November 1st. We put every single word of that in writing. I had a lawyer friend named Marcus look it over. Nothing fancy, just a 1-page sublease agreement with the dates bold-faced. Derek signed it, I signed it, we both kept copies. Before I left town, I did one more thing that turned out to matter a lot. I walked the apartment with Derek, and we both signed a move-in condition checklist. Every scuff on the wall, every loose cabinet hinge, everything that was already wrong before he touched it. 2 pages. Dated. Photographed. I emailed him a copy that same afternoon. He waved his hand at it like it was unnecessary. "Man, I'm not going to trash your place," he said, laughing. I smiled and said I was just doing it for both our protection. He signed it. I filed it. I also registered the sublease with Hartwell Residential, the property management company that held my master lease. They had a standard form for it. It took 15 minutes. The woman at the front desk told me most subletters never bother. I remember thinking that seemed like a strange thing to skip. The first sign something was off came about 6 weeks in. My downstairs neighbor, a retired postal worker named Glenn, called me to say there was a woman he'd never seen before doing laundry in the building's shared laundry room at 2 a.m, and it looked like all of Derek's stuff plus a full set of hers. Derek had mentioned a girlfriend named Brooke, but the lease was clear, 1 occupant. I texted Derek. He said she was just visiting for the week. Fine. I let it go. 3 weeks after that, Glenn called again. Brooke was now receiving mail at my address. Derek had her listed as a resident. I called Derek directly. He said, pretty casually, that Brooke had moved in because her own lease had fallen through, and it was just temporary. I reminded him what the sublease said. He told me, and I remember this exactly, dude, it's just a piece of paper. Chill out. Just a piece of paper. I wrote down the date and time of that conversation in a notes app on my phone and went to bed. That was the moment I stopped assuming good faith and started keeping records. I want to be honest about something right here. When Derek said that, I wasn't calm. My stomach dropped. I was 3 hours away, tired from a job that was harder than I'd expected, eating takeout in a furnished studio that smelled like someone else's carpet, and the person living in my actual home was telling me our signed legal agreement was just a piece of paper. That specific kind of frustration, realizing someone you extended good faith to has been privately laughing at you for it, that hits different. I sat with it. I didn't call Derek back. I didn't call Paul. I just wrote it down and went to sleep. About 2 weeks before I was due home, I texted Derek to confirm the move-out date. October 31st. He texted back that he and Brooke had been looking at apartments and hadn't found anything yet, and would probably need another month or 2. I told him that wasn't possible. My name was on the master lease. His sublease ended October 31st, period. He said he'd look harder. I called Marcus and gave him a heads up. Not a full consult, just a 5-minute call where I told him Derek was signaling he might not leave on time. Marcus said to start a paper trail now. That afternoon, I sent Derek a formal written notice by text and email both, reminding him that per the sublease, the tenancy ended October 31st, that no extension had been agreed upon, and that I would be taking possession on November 1st as planned. Tone, completely neutral. Derek replied with a thumbs-up emoji. I screenshot that too. Then I drove home on November 1st, exhausted, ready to sleep in my own bed, and found that new deadbolt. I stood in that hallway for about 30 seconds. Then I went downstairs and knocked on Glenn's door. Glenn told me he'd watched a locksmith show up that morning around 10 o'clock. Derek had let the guy in. The whole job took maybe 45 minutes. Glenn had asked Derek what was going on, and Derek told him he was renegotiating his living situation and that I'd be fine with it once I calmed down. Glenn looked at me over his glasses when he said this. Long pause. Then he said, "I didn't think you'd be fine with it." I told him he was correct. I had nowhere to sleep that night. I drove to a motel 62 miles away and paid $79 for a room. I set my phone on the nightstand. And I got to work. Here's the thing about Derek's plan. It was bold, I'll give him that. But Derek had made a few assumptions that were about to cost him. He assumed I didn't know my rights. He assumed I was too far away to move fast. And he assumed that because I was a laid-back guy, I was also a pushover. First call, Marcus. 9 p.m. on a Friday. Marcus answered, heard the situation, and immediately told me two things. 1. What Derek had done, changing the locks on a property he did not own or hold a master lease on, was illegal in our state. Full stop. 2. Because Derek was a subletter with a hard end date, not a month-to-month tenant, he was technically a trespasser as of midnight that night. Not a holdover tenant who needed a formal eviction process. A trespasser. That distinction was everything. Marcus walked me through 4 steps. I wrote them all down on the Motel 6 notepad. Step 1. Document everything. Go back to the building tonight. Photograph the new lock. Photograph the note on the door. Write out a full timeline while it's fresh. Every date, every text, every call. Timestamps would matter. Step 2. File a police report first thing in the morning. Not because the police would necessarily remove Derek on the spot, but because a formal report creates an official record that Derek changed the locks without authorization on property he had no legal right to control. That report number would be useful later. Step 3. Contact Hartwell Residential directly. My master lease had a clause prohibiting any modification to locks or entry systems without written consent from Hartwell. Derek hadn't just violated my sublease. He'd violated my master lease. That gave Hartwell standing to act, and it meant I wasn't the one forcing a confrontation. Hartwell was. Step 4. Send Derek one written notice via text and email, time-stamped, stating the sublease ended October 31st, that the lock change was unauthorized and illegal, and that he had until noon on November 2nd to surrender the keys or vacate. Flat. Factual. No anger, no threats, just facts. I drove back to the building at 10 p.m., photographed everything, drove back to the Motel 6. I wrote out the full timeline on notepad paper. I sent Derek the notice at 10:47 p.m. No response. I want to tell you what it actually felt like, sitting in that room at 11 o'clock on a Friday night, writing on a notepad with the TV off and a parking lot light cutting through the curtains. It didn't feel triumphant. It felt lonely and grinding and genuinely unfair. I had done everything right. I had written the lease. I had registered it. I had documented the move-in condition. I had sent the warnings. And I was still the one in a motel room while Derek was asleep in my bed. That's the part nobody tells you about being prepared. It doesn't stop bad things from happening. It just means you're not helpless when they do. I finished the timeline, checked every date twice, and went to sleep. November 2nd, 8 a.m. I was at the police station. The officer I spoke with, Sergeant Okafor, listened to the whole thing. He looked at the signed sublease with the October 31st end date. He looked at the photograph of the new lock. He looked at the written notice I'd sent Derek. He said this was a civil matter at its core, but he was willing to come to the address with me at noon if Derek hadn't vacated, because the unauthorized lock change gave him something to work with on property interference. At 9 a.m., I called Hartwell Residential and asked for the property manager on my account. That was a woman named Sandra. I explained the situation. I emailed her the sublease, the photographs, and the timeline while we were still on the phone. Sandra was quiet for a moment, and then said something that made me feel a lot better about how this was going to end. She said, "He changed the locks on our property without our permission? That's a lease violation. Your lease. We'll be there at noon." At 11:58, I was standing outside my building with Sergeant Okafor and Sandra from Hartwell. Glenn was in the lobby pretending to check his mail. I knocked on my own apartment door. Derek opened it, he looked at Sandra, he looked at Okafor, he looked at me. I watched the confidence leave his face. There was a beat, maybe 2 seconds, where I could see him trying to figure out which version of this he could still talk his way out of. He found none. Sandra told him, in a completely professional voice, that he had changed the locking mechanism on a Hartwell residential property without authorization, which was a direct violation of the master lease, and that he was required to surrender the premises and all keys immediately. Derek started saying something about tenant rights, and Okafor cut him off. Okafor explained the difference between a holdover tenant and someone whose fixed-term sublease had expired, which was, legally, no tenancy at all as of midnight on October 31st. Derek looked at Brooke, who was standing in the kitchen doorway holding a coffee mug. She didn't say anything. Here's what I hadn't expected. Hartwell had shown up with their own locksmith. Sandra had called him before she even left her office. The guy was standing at the end of the hallway with a bag of tools. Sandra pointed at the door and said, "Change it back to the master key system, please." Derek said, "You can't just do that while we're still here." Sandra handed him a printed notice. "You're not tenants. You need to vacate now." This is where Derek planted his feet. He told Okafor he was calling his own lawyer. Okafor said that was his right, and he could do it from outside the apartment. Derek said he wasn't leaving without a formal eviction notice and a court order. Okafor stepped into the doorway. He told Derek very calmly that he could leave voluntarily right now, or Okafor was going to make calls to determine whether the unauthorized lock change constituted criminal mischief, which could result in Derek leaving in handcuffs. Derek's choice. Brooke grabbed her coat. She was already thinking clearer than Derek was. It took 40 more minutes, but they left. Bags and garbage bags. Stuff crammed into Brooke's hatchback. Near the end, Derek stood in the hallway with a duffel bag over one shoulder and opened his mouth like he was about to make a speech. Okafor just looked at him. Whatever Derek had planned to say dissolved. He shot me a look on the way out. "I'm going to dispute everything." I said okay and held the door open for him. The locksmith changed the lock back in about 20 minutes. Sandra handed me 2 new keys. I thanked her. She said thank you for the documentation. That timeline was exactly what we needed. I walked into my apartment. The place was a mess. Dishes in the sink, Brooke's clothes still in my closet, energy drink cans lined up on the windowsill like little trophies. But it was my apartment. My name was on the lease, and Derek was in a parking lot 2 blocks away figuring out where to go. I spent that night cleaning up. That's when I found that Brooke had, at some point, adopted a cat without telling anyone. Small orange tabby, hiding under my bed, looking genuinely confused about its life choices. I texted Derek to come get it within 24 hours. He showed up the next morning, barely made eye contact, grabbed the cat carrier, and left. He did not apologize. I noted that. Now here's where it gets even better. And I want to be clear. I didn't engineer what happened next. I just let the paperwork do its job. Because Derek had changed the locks, Hartwell had a lease violation on record under my name. That was a problem for my tenant history. I asked Sandra about it directly. She said because I had reported it and cooperated immediately, there would be a note in the file documenting that the violation was caused by an unauthorized subletter, not me. She also pointed out that because the sublease was registered with their office, which Derek did not know, they had a record of Derek as the subletter and the October 31st end date. Then Sandra told me something I wasn't expecting. Hartwell was filing a property damage claim against Derek for the unauthorized lock installation. The hardware was $180, but labor and administrative costs brought the total to $340. She asked if I'd collected a security deposit from Derek. I had $340. She let me keep $158 of it against the 2 nights at the Motel 6, and the remaining $182 went back to Hartwell as partial recovery toward the damage claim. Then she said if Hartwell successfully recovered the full amount from Derek through collections, she'd send me the $158 back. I figured that money was gone. 6 weeks later, a check for $158 showed up in my mailbox with a Hartwell residential return address. Sandra had included a sticky note that just said, "He paid." That check is still on my refrigerator. I have not cashed it. I keep it there because it makes me happy every morning. But there's more. About 3 weeks after all of this, Paul, the friend who had vouched for Derek, reached out to apologize. He said Derek had been telling their friend group, that I had scammed him out of his deposit, called the police on him for no reason, and tried to make him homeless. Paul said he'd believed Derek for about 2 days, until Glenn, my downstairs neighbor Glenn, who I had never told any of this to, ran into Paul at a hardware store and told him the whole story himself. The 2 a.m. laundry sessions, the locksmith walking in, all of it. Paul called Derek out in their group chat, in front of about 12 people. He posted the factual timeline and asked Derek to explain the part where he changed the locks on someone else's property. Derek's response was to leave the group chat. Brooke stayed long enough to post one message. I told him not to do it, and then she left too. I heard through Paul that Derek and Brooke broke up about a month later. I'm not saying the apartment situation caused that, I'm just noting the timeline. Paul apologized twice when he called, once for vouching for Derek in the first place, and once for not calling sooner when he started hearing Derek's version of events. I told him I didn't blame him. He'd done what a good friend does, which is vouch for someone he believed in. Derek was the one who burned that trust. Paul sounded genuinely gutted in a way that felt real, not performative, and I told him so. We've stayed friends. He told me he'd vet anyone more carefully before making that kind of recommendation again. I believe him. Now I want to talk about the thing that actually started all of this, because I think it gets lost in the drama of the lock situation. The reason Derek thought he could do any of this was the same reason a certain kind of person always thinks they can get away with it. He decided that rules applied to other people, and that a signed agreement was just a piece of paper when it was inconvenient for him. He said that to me directly, it's just a piece of paper, chill out. I am a pretty chill person, I don't like confrontation, I'd let the girlfriend thing go. I'd let a late utility payment go, I'd let a lot of small things slide because I figured Derek was an adult who'd handle his business. And what he learned from that, what people like Derek always learn from that, is that chill means weak. That patience means you can be pushed. So here's what I actually did. I didn't yell, I didn't threaten, I didn't show up at midnight, or blast him on social media or call Paul to rally people against him. I read the documents I had already signed, made 3 phone calls, and showed up at noon with the right people. That's it. Every bit of leverage I had was leverage I had already built in months earlier, just by doing the paperwork correctly. That's the thing about Derek's type. They're counting on you not having done the paperwork. I had done the paperwork. For anyone wondering what would have happened if Derek had refused to leave even with Okafor there, I would have started the formal eviction process that same afternoon, filed in small claims for the motel costs and any additional hotel nights, and let Hartwell's lawyers handle the lock situation. It would have taken longer and cost more, but the outcome was the same. Derek had no legal ground to stand on. He had a sublease that said October 31st. He was there on November 2nd. That's the whole case. But he left. So it cost me $158 for 2 nights at a Motel 6, 1 conversation with Marcus, and about 4 hours of my Saturday, all of which I got back. I'm writing this from my apartment, my own furniture, my own kitchen. Derek, according to Paul, is now renting a room in a house with 3 other people, paying $750 a month, and is on a landlord blacklist that Hartwell maintains and shares with 2 other property management companies in the area. I didn't ask for that. That was Hartwell's doing. Apparently they take unauthorized lock changes very seriously. Glenn stopped me in the lobby about 2 weeks after everything settled down. He handed me a box of homemade shortbread cookies. His wife made them, and said, "I'm glad you came back. The building's quieter." I ate those cookies in about 2 days. They were excellent. So that's the whole thing. I lost 1 weekend. I spent $158 on a motel. I made 3 phone calls and typed up a timeline. And Derek lost his deposit, got filed against by Hartwell, got called out in front of 12 people by his own friend, and landed on a property management blacklist. I didn't do a single thing that wasn't completely legal and completely justified. I didn't make any move he hadn't made first. I just made sure that when he decided a piece of paper was his strategy, I was the one holding the paper. Sometimes, the most satisfying outcome is just being more prepared than the other person expected. So I'm curious, if you came home and found a brand new lock on your own front door, what would you have done first? Drop it in the comments.